I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, the Department of City Planning Director Dan Garodnick joins us to discuss building a city for the future. We'll discuss density, zoning, housing, and some recently announced projects for the city. But first, the state budget progress. There has been some. According to Governor Kathy Hochul, the $237 billion budget has been agreed upon, including the contentious issues that have been holding it up, namely housing, public safety, migrant support. The latest news, a security breach was holding things up. Now that seems to be settled. New York Times reporter Grace Ashford has been covering the negotiations up in Albany, and she joins us now. Grace, what has been the biggest hang-up in getting this budget passed, even though it's already been late for a couple of days?
Hi, Sam. Thanks so much for having me.
Sure.
You hit the nail on the head with your list. I think housing really is the top of mind, and I think everyone in the state of New York knows this is an incredibly important issue, but also an incredibly contentious one, a thorny one, one that has a lot of diverse stakeholders with really different ideas of what needs to happen. This is not by any measure of the imagination the first time this has been taken up. In fact, just last year, Governor Hochul put forth a really kind of sweeping proposal that she said she wanted to build 800,000 new units across the state of New York with a bunch of different things, but one of them was going to actually require kind of quotas across the state. This plan hit widespread opposition and ultimately kind of collapsed. But what we were left with was this real kind of acknowledgement that housing was really important and needed to get done. So since then, the governor has been really making it her mission to say, she's the person who is pushing it through. The legislature may disagree with that a little bit. They have their own ideas. They say it's not just about supply, it's also about tenant protections and making sure that the housing, is really serving people, not just that it exists. And so all of those kind of discussions are what everyone has been pretty bogged down with up here in Albany, although it does seem like there is finally some light at the end of the tunnel.
Grace, how does her plan this year differ from what she proposed last year, and how did she deal with the blowback last year?
Yeah, so last year, as I said, she had these quotas, kind of, I guess, the stick approach. This year has been all about carrots. In fact, at one press conference, she actually came with a prop that was a big bundle of carrots. Quite the visual. So she has about $650 million that she is allotting, pardon me, to set aside for communities that voluntarily decide to be pro-housing. So that's sort of, how she's getting around that. And then otherwise, the deal looks similarly. She wants to renew this developer tax credit. It's sort of the successor to 421A, if your viewers are familiar with that. This is going to be called 485X. And it will also have some it will also have labor standards this year. That is the big change, and part of what held up negotiations. But in addition, there are a bunch of smaller proposals, building on state-owned land, infill money for upstate, and a whole bunch of other things.
Are the carrots to persuade neighborhoods and particularly suburban areas to accept affordable housing, change zoning and other things to allow more affordable housing to be built there?
Yeah, I think it's about trying to bring the entire community along to say, the state wants to invest in helping you revitalize your Main Street, but, in order to do that, you want to meet us halfway. And, we will, by kind of having this kind of idea of, we are a growing community. We want to make it easier for people to live here and live here affordably.
And the flip side, protection for tenants, rent protections. What is in the legislation? What's in the new budget in terms of that?
This is the other very contentious issue. Progressives and housing advocates have been pretty united in pushing for a proposal called good cause eviction. And this is a tenant protection that would help to require landlords to always provide renewal leases, so that tenants are not kind of being turned out without advance notice. and if they don't want to be. And it would also kind of cap increases. Now, this has also been very contentious as well. Landlords, particularly small landlords, say this creates an undue burden on them, and that it will literally make it very difficult for them to continue to upkeep their homes and also to be profitable. So this is the other thing about this that has been really contentious, is that it would essentially, extend protections to areas of the housing market that have previously been completely unregulated. Anyway, sort of an ideological issue at stake here. Where we have sort of landed is that there will be advanced and increased tenant protections. They are not as sweeping, however, as lawmakers and housing advocates have wanted. In fact, some are even would call this a gutted version of good cause. Specifically, they say that there are these kind of caveats and exemptions that limit the scope, such that it makes it really difficult to enforce and really difficult for tenants to know if, in fact, they even have these protections. So one of those is that as I said, lawmakers were really sensitive to the plight of small property owners. So the law is written such that it only applies, these protections only apply to owners who have a certain number of units. I think it's about 10. So if you have, 8 units, then you're not subject to good cause, or rather your tenants don't have the protections of good cause. And if you have 11, then they do. However, it's not always clear how many units your landlord owns. I mean, for renters in New York City and beyond. And so this issue of disclosure and how tenants will know whether or not they're covered is currently being negotiated.
Grace, how did New York City make out in the state budget as far as we know so far, particularly in terms of help for migrants?
Yeah, I mean, I would say New York City did pretty well, and especially, Mayor Adams did pretty well. He came up to Albany, right around the time the governor was putting out her budget, and he asked for billions of dollars. What the governor was able to come back with was $2.4 billion, which is an increase from last year. It includes about $500,000 that the state is pulling out of its reserves to give to the city to help address the migrant crisis. And although the governor or the mayor, pardon me, says that it's not quite enough, I think he's going to be appreciative that it is more than last year. And this actually, I will say, is something that the lawmakers were pretty united in their support of. So the governor said $2.4 billion, and $2.4 billion is what appears to be in the final budget.
And an issue particularly of concern to many of our viewers, City University. How did it come out in terms of budget allocation?
I don't have the exact details on City University. I apologize. In fact, the bills are just this morning beginning to finally be printed. So we are still, in the very Albany way, getting the final details right on the eve of voting.
And as you pointed out, more money for migrants, more money for other things. Where's this money coming from? Are there any new taxes?
Yeah, this is a good question. So there are not any new taxes. I will start by saying that in terms of there are no new kind of income taxes. The legislature has proposed them, increasing taxes specifically just on the wealthy. They say, the wealthiest of the wealthy. Governor Hochul says, no, this is a line that she will not cross. And in fact, this year, she didn't really have much reason to even think about doing so. The state's revenue projections were a little more generous, or were less generous than what they ended up receiving. So she had some extra money to throw around, and that made things a little easier.
Grace Ashford of the New York Times from Albany, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up next, New York City Planning Director Dan Garodnick shares his department's plans for the future. Faced with several major issues affecting the city in recent years, Mayor Eric Adams has introduced his vision for a more inclusive and equitable New York, one that will create more affordable housing, support small businesses, and promote sustainability. He calls it City of Yes. Appointed by Mayor Adams in 2022, New York City Planning Commission Chairman Dan Garodnick is in charge of carrying out the mayor's vision. Dan, thank you for joining us. What is City of Yes, and where's it going to get us over the next couple of years?
Well, thanks, Sam. Well, first of all, City of Yes is a way of describing 3 citywide initiatives that are zoning text amendments. One of them, which makes it easier for you to make sustainable changes to your own buildings, to allow us to have a greener city, and to give building owners an easier chance to comply with some local laws that are coming into effect in the coming years. One of them, for economic opportunity, tries to do away with very antiquated rules that live in our own zoning resolution, which make it very difficult for you to innovate, for you to grow a business, for you to locate a business. We have so many references that come out of our 1961 zoning resolution, that focus on things like model car hobby shops or typewriter repair, and much too little that relate to 3D printing or virtual reality. So we need to upgrade and modernize our zoning resolution for a 21st century economy. And then our third proposal, which is the one that is about to become live, relates to housing. And we are in a serious crisis in New York City, not years in the making, but decades in the making. And the mayor has charged us to go big and to introduce a proposal that will really move the needle for the next 60 to 80 years in New York City to deal with that challenge, and that's what's coming next.
As we heard, we're also dealing with legislation on housing up in Albany. What would this city initiative do?
So our proposal, City of Yes for Housing Opportunity, would create a little bit more housing in every neighborhood around the city. With a 1.41% vacancy rate, which is what we have right now. It's the lowest since 1968, which is really hurting New Yorkers. The price of rent, the pressures of gentrification, homelessness, the imbalance of power between landlords and tenants in New York City, it is having a real impact on New Yorkers. We don't need to live this way. The proposal itself does a variety of things. It allows for incentives and bonuses for the creation of affordable housing in medium and high density areas. It allows for transit-oriented development, so near subway stops. It gives an opportunity for you to build these missing middle types of apartment buildings, 3 to 5 stories. Similarly, in commercial corridors, so a single story of commercial that you see all around New York City, the ability to do these modest apartment buildings there. Gives an opportunity to do office to residential conversions, and it finally does away with what we have in our zoning as a minimum mandatory parking regulation for every project in every neighborhood around the city, which is too frequently coming at the expense of housing. So it's got a lot of different components to it, designed to create a little bit everywhere, but not to do dramatic changes in individual neighborhoods, which I think people frequently worry about. So we're going to spread it out and make sure that we do something meaningful for housing, and we're going to do it this year.
Just about everybody wants more affordable housing, of course, depending on how we define affordable. People don't want more density for the most part. How do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting issue. Over the last 20 years, we have seen that entire areas of the city have been functionally shut off from the creation of housing. In 2022, we saw that 9 of our community districts in New York City created as much housing as the other 50 combined. So for those other 50, by not enabling any functional housing creation, it's putting real pressure on other parts of the city, driving up rents and creating issues for all New Yorkers, no matter where they live in that breakdown. So what we need to do here is to break down these invisible barriers that exist and to allow for modest amounts of new density on the margins of low density areas, and to reintroduce building types which are already all around New York City. It's just that they were built, these 3 to 5 story apartment buildings, they were built before 1961, but our rules today don't even allow them to be reintroduced. We're going to do that as part of this proposal, and they're the sorts of buildings that people recognize, they live with without difficulty, but it's on us to make our case as to why that will not be disruptive in the neighborhoods around New York.
New York is constantly changing. In fact, change is the one constant in New York, but people don't like change. So how do you persuade them that new uses for buildings, commercial uses that aren't allowed now, that new housing, new density, new buildings going up where there weren't buildings before, are going to be okay, that people can live with them? What's the incentive for people to go along with that, other than saying, well, it's going to be nice for everyone and more people will be able to afford to live? What's in it for me?
Well, the incentive is that it is an important prerogative for the city and the city's overall health, for our economic development, for us to have enough housing so that businesses do not look elsewhere when they're considering where to locate. The overall cost of housing for everybody is up as a result of our inability to produce sufficient amounts of housing. I didn't mention it before, but it's another important piece of the puzzle. We want to enable individual homeowners the flexibility to add a unit on their own property as an accessory dwelling unit up to 800 square feet, something which is really important for multi-generational families.
That would be like basement apartments?
Could be in an attic, it could be in a garage, but limited to 800 square feet. And this has worked very well all throughout this country. And not everybody is going to want to take advantage of it. But for those who do, it is very important. Families that want to stay together, or a kid who's coming home from college, or the ability to pay your mortgage. These are really important tools that homeowners of New York City should be able to take advantage of, and we want to give them that opportunity. So we think that by making the case of the crunch that we are in and the costs, the human cost to all of us, that we hope to be able to be successful when it lands at the City Council at the end of the year.
Dan, quantify this, if you will. How many more apartments will we be able to create in what period of time if this legislation goes through?
So we project, for this proposal only, it will generate about 100,000 units over the next 15 years. But when you make changes in zoning, they live on for a much longer period of time, of course. We're looking backwards to our zoning resolution and changes made in 1961, and with these changes, we'll look forward to 2084 and beyond. There will be lots of changes over time, state tax incentive policies, interest rate environments, and neighborhood changes, which will affect what happens over time. But we believe that we're setting the rules in a way that will incentivize something to happen. But 100,000 over 15 years is what we project most immediately.
And 100,000 over 15 years is what proportion of what we envision that we really need?
Well, the mayor has set a moonshot goal of 500,000 units, so this is a piece of that puzzle. We need to have all players here rowing the boat in the same direction for us to get to that goal, but this is a meaningful and important part of that, and these are rule changes that we can make ourselves in New York City through zoning, in partnership between the mayor and the city council, and we're really excited to have this conversation this year. It's long overdue.
We talk a lot since the pandemic about converting office buildings to residential. Lots of, as you and others have talked about before, lots of physical obstacles to doing that, the way buildings are laid out, the age of buildings. How feasible is that? What percentage of office buildings can practically be converted to residential?
Well, it's a hard question to answer because it's such an individualized building determination, building by building. Our rules today make it extremely difficult for a building to even consider the possibility. If the building is not built before 1961 and is functionally in lower Manhattan or midtown Manhattan, you can't even take advantage of our more relaxed rules to enable an office to residential conversion. The rules 1977 Lower Manhattan, 1961 in Midtown. We want to change the date of eligibility to 1990. We want to broaden the geography to make it citywide. We will enable another 136 million square feet of commercial office space to be eligible for conversion. We don't expect 136 million square feet to convert, but it is a significant move in the right direction for flexibility here. That's more office space than even exists in the city of Philadelphia. And with a 20% vacancy rate in our commercial office stock, we need to enable this. We need to do it now. We're encouraged that as part of the Albany budget deal, there's an incentive for office to residential conversion, which includes an affordability component. This is moving us in the right track. We want to throw a lifeline to office buildings that are not performing and create housing in the process. But it becomes a building by building calculation because it is complicated. The physical configuration is meaningful. The individual building owners' appetite for risk, their access to capital, all of those things are factors for an individual building, and of course the tenants of the building itself.
You were instrumental in rezoning the east side of Manhattan, making it easier to build higher buildings, increasing the density, and with that creating incentives that presumably will make life more pleasant in that area. And some of those office buildings are now either built or about to be, one that was announced recently at 350 Park. But given changes in habits because of the pandemic, who's going to fill those office buildings?
Right, we're really encouraged by the fact that the East Midtown rezoning continues to bear fruit. What we saw back in the years 2015 to 2017 was that our commercial office stock was getting older. Our zoning rules were inconsistent with anybody making change to create a new office building. So we delivered the incentives that you described, make improvements to mass transit, deliver into a public realm fund, support local landmarks, and we will give you the opportunity to build a more significant building. That's what you see at 350 Park Avenue. That's what you see with JP Morgan Chase. I expect there will be others down the pike. And it's an important signal. It's an important signal about where these property interests and owners see for the future of commercial real estate in New York City. They're investing in new buildings in Midtown Manhattan, and I think it's a very strong signal about the overall health and future of our local economy. Even while, on the other hand, we do see vacancies for commercial office buildings more broadly. So we want to hit the right mark here, create incentives and opportunities for underperforming buildings to convert to housing, while also incentivizing great new Class A commercial office buildings like the one that is being proposed at 350 Park. And we're going to see the results of pandemic living, post-pandemic life for many years to come, but we're really encouraged by these big investments that continue to be made in New York City.
Traffic and mass transit. Challenges that nobody would want to take on at this point. But how are you going to deal with that in a city that is so congested? I'm a skeptic about congestion pricing reducing traffic very much, but how do you deal with that, and how do you persuade people, safety issue apart, to use mass transit and to make mass transit more available, more user-friendly, more accessible?
Well, to me, the key for the way we need to think about our mass transit issues is no surprises, reliability. People want to be able to engage with the mass transit system of New York City in a way where it is not extended or unreasonable amounts of time to wait for the next train, and that nothing happens when you are down in the subway system or on a bus that makes you uncomfortable or fearful at any point. No surprises. So what we are seeing over time, more and more people are coming back to the mass transit system, which is very good and important. It continues to be the lifeblood of New York City and to move people around to their homes and jobs reliably and throughout the day and throughout the night. In terms of congestion, and the issues, this is a long-standing issue. It's costing us, $20 billion of economic activity a year. I'm a supporter of congestion pricing. I think that, by incentivizing people to make different decisions and also generating real money for mass transit improvements, it's an important initiative. And we'll see once it goes into effect what impact it has. And of course, we'll be able to reevaluate and see what's working and what is not. But when you think about the lost economic opportunities and the failure of emergency vehicles to be able to get through with ease, these are real issues that deserve our urgent attention here.
Indeed. Thank you, Dan Garodnick, the chairman of the New York City Planning Commission. And coming up next, I'll share some thoughts on the New York game. Mention the city game, and most people think of basketball. The historian Kevin Baker thinks the hoopla is misplaced. In his latest book, he argues convincingly that not only is baseball the city game, it's the New York game. Moreover, he writes, the dreams of Fields, of Abner Doubleday in Cooperstown belie baseball's genuine origins. For all the efforts to slap a pastoral gloss on the sport, he writes, it was always a city game. No wonder why a superintendent of New York State's lunatic asylum once prescribed baseball as a homeopathic cure for mental illness. Sports is made for second guessing, but according to most accounts of the game's professional evolution, metropolitan New York gave birth to the bunt, the box score, stolen bases. The city is where baseball teams first kept score, where the first All-Star and World Championship games were played, where the proverbial baseball cap became standard gear, where the first game was televised, where the only player in the history of Major League Baseball was struck and killed on the field by a pitch, where the roster of Major League players was finally racially integrated, where, as far as we know, the only World Series game was fixed by gamblers, where the only perfect World Series game was pitched. The curveball was invented in New York, a sneaky maneuver that 19th century fusspots reflexively associated with big city immorality. I understand that a curveball is thrown with a deliberate purpose to deceive, fumed Charles Eliot, the stiff-necked president of America's leading university. Surely this is not an ability we would want to foster at Harvard. But in the Times Book Review, Adam Gopnik quoted Philip Roth as saying that listening to the eloquent Southerner Red Barber narrating the adventures of the Brooklyn Dodgers taught him more about the power of point of view than any English class did. Can any sport, much less baseball, bind the city together as baseball once did? New York winning isn't everything, of course, but the Yankees haven't been World Series champs since 2009, and the Mets won only twice in their 62-year history. Maybe, Baker writes, another version of this bonding is already underway around multiplayer video games that form communities, stretching improbably and beautifully across age cohorts. And he says they do teach agency of a kind. It's not the same. It never is. As one ball player lamented once, the game became more about pay than play. He said, quote, somehow or other, they don't play ball nowadays as they used to. I don't mean to say they don't play as well, he said, but I mean that they don't play with the same kind of feelings they used to. It just wasn't like it was. Some things don't change, though. The player we quoted was expressing his lament in 1868. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.